behalf of our panel discussion on the issue of BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions against Israel. My name is Oliver Haschemizadeh and I am a member of one of the Austrian groups who are supporting the international campaign BDS, and I would like to welcome you most warmly to our panel discussion. Firstly, I will introduce our two speakers. On my right, Birgit Althaler. She's a translator and for many years now political activist and co-founder of BDS Switzerland. She studied in Vienna and lives now in Basel in Switzerland. She translated books such as Nestle, Anatomy of a Global Company for the organization Attack. BDS Switzerland is a very active BDS group with many good activities, and I think we can learn a lot from BDS Austria. So welcome Birgit, herzlich willkommen, Ahlan wa sahlan. And I'm also very happy to welcome Ronnie Barkan in Vienna. Ronnie is an Israeli human rights activist and co-founder of Boycott from Within, a group of Israeli citizens and residents which supports the Palestinian call for BDS. Having been involved in protests against the Israeli wall of separation in the West Bank since 2004, he took his activism a step further by helping to found the organization Boycott from Within 4 years later. Raised in a small town near Tel Aviv, Ronnie has been arrested on many occasions and imprisoned 5 times. Describing himself as a privileged Jew, he knows that he has been treated far more leniently by the Israeli authorities as the Palestinians are. Yesterday he told us at one demonstration in the village of Berlin, he was arrested alongside a local activist, Adib Abu Rahma, whereas Ronnie was jailed for 2 nights. Abu Rahma spent 18 months in a military prison before being released in December 2010. Whilst not wishing to anticipate the contributions of the discussion and the debate, let me just say some words about BDS for those who perhaps may well not even heard about it. The global movement for campaign of boycott, disinvestment and sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law and Palestinian rights was initiated by the Palestinian civil society in 2005 and in cooperation, it is coordinated by the Palestinian BDS National Committee since established in 2007. BDS is a strategy that allows people of conscience to play an effective role in the Palestinian struggle for justice, freedom and equality. For decades, Israel has denied Palestinians their fundamental rights of freedom, equality and self-determination through ethnic cleansing, colonization, racial discrimination and military occupation. Despite countless condemnations of Israel policy by the UN and other international bodies and human rights organizations, the world community has failed to hold Israel accountable and enforce compliance with basic principle laws, international laws. Israel's crimes have continued with impunity. In view of this continued failure, Palestinian civil society called for a global citizen response. On July 2005, a year after the historical advisory of the International Court for Justice on the illegality of the Israeli wall in the occupied Palestinian territories, a clear majority of Palestinian civil society called upon their counterparts and people of conscience all over the world to launch broad boycotts, implement divestments initiatives and to demand sanctions against Israel until Palestinian rights were recognized in full compliance with international law. BDS seems to be an effective tool for a worldwide civil society not longer standing beside but getting active. Saying that, I would like to hand over to Birgit Althaler, who will make a deeper introduction to the issue. Please.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. Thank you for being invited here to Vienna, where effectively I did my my studies and where I also got my first political education and where I also was confronted first with the Palestinian question some 20 years ago, and since then I'm living in Switzerland. The title of the conference was Stop Apartheid, Boycott Israel. I would like to address a little bit the concept of apartheid in the third part of my introduction. And also Oliver already explained what BDS stands for, so it's not only boycott, but boycott is the level where civil society can make pressure on Israel, on Israeli politics, but we will talk about a little bit at least about all elements of the BDS campaign. I would like to shortly explain my ideas, plan of the presentation. I would like to repeat or give a short version again about what BDS stands for. Then come to the context in which the Palestinian civil society developed this campaign and launched it in 2005. Then I would like to address some of the discussions that takes place in the Palestinian civil society today to further develop the campaign or the elements of analysis of the conflict we are dealing with. Fourth point would be to give some elements of what we did in Switzerland and to conclude with why I consider the BDS a very important campaign if one wants to work in solidarity with the Palestinians. So, about the short version of BDS are the elements which I consider important. And I'm sorry, I guess we will repeat each other a little bit, but I hope not too much. So BDS is the element of boycott, which is the instrument that civil society can take in many cases, in many political situations where you want to make pressure on someone, either on companies, either on states. And it's a very common tool to try to make pressure. So it's not invented for this specific case of Palestine. And it would end at a specific condition. So it's not a tool in itself, so it's linked to the demands that the BDS call has formulated. And as soon as the Palestinian civil society will say, okay, now these demands are more or less, we reached to some conclusions that we consider enough, then we would finish with this boycott campaign. The divestment or disinvestment, different terminologies are used. It's the level where institutions are addressed. It means that, for instance, churches or companies or even states who have funds somewhere in either in Israeli companies or in Israeli banks or in Israeli institutions that are to some extent complicit to the situation of injustice, that these companies are asked to withdraw their money or their funds they have in these companies. And it is not only addressed or it's not only the idea that you would divest from companies or institutions in Israel, but also international companies like you might have heard about the campaign against Caterpillar or against Veolia or many other companies, internationals, which are to some extent or the other implicated in this situation in Israel-Palestine and therefore are targets of this divestment campaign. It's an instrument that is mainly used, or there's a long tradition of using it in mainly in churches, but there is also all kind of banks, for instance, that want to have a politics of fair investment and so on. So you could address all these companies and institutions. The third part, the sanctions, is meant that it's an instrument that states use. So sanctions, you know now, states have legal means to impose to put pressure on other states, and in some cases these instruments are used very quickly. So for Switzerland, let's say there are sanctions on about 24 states around the world, and as you have seen now with Ukraine or with other situations, it might be very quick that states decide, okay, we put sanctions on the country, we try to make pressure. In the Israeli case, no sanctions, as far as we know, no sanctions have been decided, but it's one element where definitely this BDS campaign wants to address the governments and make pressure in order that they not only take sanctions as a political will, but first of all that they do what they normally would be obliged to do according to international law. There is some specific obligations that states would have to decide and to implement, and that so far they don't do. So these are the three elements, the three instruments. The Palestinian call unites three demands. The idea behind is that there is the Palestinian people as a whole, which are affected from Israeli politics. They count now more than 11 million people. Half of them are living somewhere in the world in exile, but they also still have their rights. Many of them are refugees, most of them living in the surrounding countries. Until today, they have their fundamental rights that Israel violates daily by, for instance, not allowing the right of return. So this is one part of the Palestinians, or of the Palestinian people, which, according to international law, has a right of self-determination. So the second part of Palestinians, which mostly is talked about when one talks about Palestinians today, it's the Palestinians in the occupied territories, so the West Bank and Gaza Strip and Eastern Jerusalem. Also, out of these, many are refugees. And the third part, which is often forgotten, is the Palestinians that live in Israel. It's 1/5 of the Israeli population, or about 1 million, more than 1 million Palestinians today live in Israel and have Israeli citizenship, but there is a kind of institutionalized discrimination and also a discrimination in their daily practices. And the BDS call, the importance of this call was that since a long time, or for the first time since many years, it reunited these three groups of Palestinians and formulated demands for all of them. So the three demands are for the refugees, the right of return, for the Palestinians in Israel, the end of this institutionalized discrimination, and for the occupied territories, the end of occupation, of course, and the dismantlement of the wall and all questions which are linked to this situation of occupation regime. So other elements or characteristics of this campaign, it is rights-based, so it makes a reference to international law, and it's very much inspired by the experience of the anti-apartheid movement, not only in ideas, but there's also big support for the BDS campaign coming from South Africa, and also in terms of analyzing the situation or the structure of the Israeli regime as an apartheid regime, in legal terms, not as an insult, but in really legal terms. So there is a big Like an important factor comes from what the anti-apartheid movement fought for until the regime changed. As to the structure, there is this call in 2005. 1 year later, the Palestinians, the organizations that launched this call, they formed a kind of national leadership, which is called the BNC. It coordinates the work there. It coordinates, or it also publishes all kind of information, calls, and explanations also for if you talk about cultural boycott, for instance, which is a quite difficult topic sometimes to tackle. Then they try also to give an orientation about what are the criteria to use such a tool of boycott. But it's not a leadership for the worldwide campaign. The BNC basically formulated the call, the demands. They would be the ones who decide when or how to continue with the campaign, but the campaign on the worldwide basis functions like in a decentralized way, but with a lot of coordination between different countries, between different elements of the campaign. So there's a coordination, for instance, for those who work on the military level, or for those who work on consumers boycott, or on other elements. Finally, BDS campaign uses proactive and reactive means. That it means that sometimes you invent yourself the targets and the tools without being in urgency. It's not, that would be one element. You think about which question you want to work on, or the other possibility, reactive, is if, for instance, there's some important person who is invited to Vienna, or if there's a concert, or something where you could react, or if they again make like this Israel, the speech, or things like that, and then you think it's really the thing where you have to react, where you could not stay quiet. So both possibilities exist, and everyone looks for the opportunities you have with the people you have, and with the money you have, and with the ideas you have, and all of that. Okay, so this BDS campaign after 2005, it really spread very quickly and at the world level. And in Switzerland also we started very early to take up this new initiative and to work on it. Now I would like to go a little bit into the framework or the context in which the call was launched. And it's not only just a campaign with strategies and tools and so on, but it's an answer, as I already mentioned before, it's an answer to a specific situation, and one important element of this situation is this fragmentation of Palestinian people. So the fact that they are split, they are living in different conditions under different rules. I mean, the ones with military rule, the others as second-class citizens of a state, the others as refugees, and others as, I don't know, in the diaspora, in different situations. So this was one element which influenced this elaboration of the BDS campaign. I don't want to go into the whole history of the conflict, but just, I mean, not the 100 years of Zionist colonization or the from 48 on, but I would like to focus on the framework of the Oslo treaties, of the Oslo Accord, or as some might have heard Helga Baumgarten, who called it the system of Oslo, and the logics that this context created. we all know that Oslo failed. But the question is not exactly why it failed. For me, the most important point is that from the beginning, quite from the beginning, it was a failure in the sense of what was the content of this treaty. So Oslo forced the Palestinians into a kind of bilateral negotiation framework, which reduced the whole question of solutions to a question of a power play. So it's rather you have the two partners, and you have like the United States that are supervising this process, it was also quite from the beginning, it was clear that Oslo process would exclude as much as possible the references to international law. So they did not talk about rights, it was talks about the control, and it's the basic thing is that Oslo left Israel with the full control of the land, of borders, of economy, and also of the control of the population. In fact, Israel kept the control of all important parts. Nowadays, you always, or many think that it was in exchange of a promise of a state, which is even not part of any of the Oslo treaties, so this was a misunderstanding, but beside that, it was a completely unequal contract, and the other states which support this framework until today, although since almost 20 years we talk about the failure of this framework, it still continues to be the reference for all the diplomatic and political level sphere. All states, Switzerland, Austria and so on, they all make reference to this system, and they impose more or less to the Palestinians to continue the same, although there is no perspective of any meaningful issue of this campaign, of these negotiations. The Western states, their answer, or they compensated with humanitarian aid and with aid for the development aid. That's what they put. They put in a lot of money, but they don't allow that there is a meaningful discussion on the rights on the fundamental rights of Palestinians. And it was even said from time to time, and until recently, John Kerry said, if Palestinians ask for rights, or if they do steps that are rights-based, they say, it's not helpful to come to a solution. In Oslo also there was, the question of refugees was very quickly reduced to a kind of symbolic solution. So you would give Israel the right to decide on a small quota of Palestinians that would be allowed to come back to the country, and you would, and if not, in exchange of the end of all further claims of Palestinian refugees. So this was one very important element in Oslo. And the other one, the Palestinians inside Israel, they were not at all a subject of this negotiation framework, so they were considered like an internal affair of Israel. The consequences of this whole framework that exists until today, it was that Israel, with impunity, could continue its expansion in the occupied territories. It could continue its politics of transfer and all kinds of violations of international law in Israel itself and in the occupied territories, and stabilize its control over the whole of historic Palestine. On the outside, Palestinians today live in a worse situation than ever concerning freedoms, rights, and also resources, control over resources and economic situation. This was the framework in which Palestinian civil society developed this BDS call and came to the conclusion that first we have to come back to the question of rights and not of power play or power relation. Secondly, we have to put again the question of the refugees on the table. And there were in the whole, from 2000, I don't know when exactly, or even before, you had all this kind of new discussion or strong discussions in the refugee camps about the Nakba. There were a lot of celebrations. There were new publications, oral history on the question of the refugees. So there was really a whole movement in the Palestinian civil society to inform and to inform about the Nakba and to insist on the fact that the question of the right of return is a basic element in answer, or if you want to confront the Israeli politics of expulsion. The logic answer of the expulsion is the people can return. So this was one important movement that led to this BDS call, and the other one was also Palestinians inside Israel. There was also some important and interesting initiatives, like there was a paper formulated which was called the Future Vision of Palestinians in Israel, where they started to discuss and made like a systematic analysis about the whole structure of discrimination they face in the country on the level of laws and on the level of practices, and yeah, on these two levels. So this was two important elements. And then the third element, and which already makes a link to the current discussions, is what Oliver also mentioned, is the legal opinion of the International Court of Justice on the question of the effects of the wall. And this legal opinion did not only give a clear statement on the question of the wall, but it also for the first time since a long period, it was a quite systematic way of analyzing the Israeli violations of international law. So here, for the first time, you find a very good legal reference for all the violations that Israel commits on a daily basis. And it also, maybe for the first time, very clearly states that there is obligations of the third states. So all the European states and so on, it's not that it's their business to come to a conclusion or a solution. We also have legal obligations not for all kind of human rights violations. Unfortunately, I mean, international law is also a question of politics and influence and political will, but a whole series of violations of international law, they really demand from third states that they do not accept the situation of injustice which is created, and they do, they coordinate each other to change the situation and so on. So there's some, and basically, without going into the details of international law, but basically it's like what is called grief breaches of international law that demand states to act. On the Palestinian side nowadays there is, or in the civil society and in the circles that launched the BDS call, but also others, they consider this legal opinion as very important. They continue to work on the analysis of what really is the characteristics of Israel's regime over Palestinians, and there is a new attempt to make categories about the about the rights violations that affect all Palestinians, which means there is several categories of violations of international law that affect the refugees as much as the Palestinians inside Israel, as much as Palestinians living under occupation. And basically it's one element is the destruction of property, expropriation, expulsion. It's one big block. Second one is how they deal with the population, because it's a conflict about land and population. So the question of the civil status, that you withdraw the right of living in the country or living in Jerusalem. The third block would be restrictions on the freedom of movement. The fourth block would be the whole concept of racial discrimination, which in the end leads to what is defined in international law as apartheid. And the fifth block would be the reaction of the Israeli regime on all kind of oppositional work, which means the repression and all the question of prisoners and so on. So these elements all affect, and so it's an idea of trying to give a systematic image of Israeli politics from 48 until now and affecting all the three parts of the Palestinian people. The conclusion, and it's used more and more, is on the one hand that you characterize this apartheid and that you characterize it as a regime of colonialism, and to be more precise, as settler colonialism, which means that you have one new coming society, the colonialists, that try to get rid of the local population. Both of these crimes in international law, they demand or they imply that third states act, that they do things to stop this situation of injustice. So that they make Israel accountable for the violations they commit. So this is, let's say, this kind of further development of the BDS campaign, or the background, the political background and analysis, where we work or on which the BDS activities are based. So very briefly, maybe we would come back to it later, about BDS in Switzerland. We thought, okay, when we started, the first step was to inform about the aims and of the BDS campaign and about the analysis and the logics of BDS campaign. We used our newspaper we already had before, and we had some special pages where we explained the different elements of the BDS campaign. We very quickly tried to integrate people which were known, like politicians or other people who are known or who play, or some players like in NGOs or in churches and so on, to address them. And then we also started to define several elements of our campaign with concrete targets. One element was the consumers boycott, which we still are working in. We have this leaflet which says Israeli products, no thanks. The idea was to use a situation when we go to shops and we tell people why eventually they should not buy Israeli products. Many of them said, but since a long time I don't. So it was an idea to take up this kind of reaction and say, no problem, we don't, or to make it like something which is normal. But it's linked, of course, to the conditions until Israel complies with international law. So it's not an end in itself, it ends when there is the conditions where this campaign is not necessary anymore. We had an information, and there is a lot of information on the Palestinian side and also with Israeli NGOs like Who Profits, a lot of very detailed information about companies who export food or other products or cosmetics or whatever. So it's not difficult to find the material to make campaigns on. This was one part. Another part, and then I just show you this paper. This was like a big success in terms of we succeeded to make a step further. We had about 50 people in Switzerland, and half of them are politicians or people who are known somewhere in political or in the public sphere. So you had members of parliament or also members of local parliament who support this consumers boycott. And this we had a chance. We could convince a newspaper, a weekly newspaper, some might know it, Wochenschrift, to send it. So 15,000 copies were sent to interested people in Switzerland. This was quite a good success, and what was nice in this case is that the politicians, they were quite well prepared to be asked by the journalists. The day after, some of them, they were contacted and they answered quite well. So it was really, we were not as well prepared as they were, because, I mean, as you might know, this campaign from below, we always lack money, we lack people and so on, so we were not really prepared to answer all the questions of journalists, but the journalists didn't want to ask us, they wanted to ask these few known politicians, and they were quite well prepared. So this was a good step further. And now we are dealing, and it was addressed against the two in Switzerland. Normally people go for shopping either with Coop or with Migros. There's the big, two big distributors, so either Migros or Coop, and it was addressed to the two big distributors, and we are, at least with one of them, we are now in negotiation. They were quite responsive and they said, okay, they would not want to buy products from companies that are involved in human rights violations. Then they said they would not like to buy products from companies which are involved in the settlements. It's not very clear, but we are in the process of negotiation, and I hope there will be some positive results. Before going into the rest, just say, or as I said before, sometimes we have good opportunities. We had the opportunity that in Basel they organized a festival, a cultural festival, which was called Culturescapes, and every year it focuses on one country. 2 years ago it focused on Israel, and this was our opportunity to say, no, we do not accept this. It's of course all this kind of institutional support in the framework of an Israeli campaign to whitewash or to give Israel like a face, the image of an interesting and open society with freedom of speech and so on. Our focus, of course, was to show that all this kind of democratic appearance has its limit when it comes to the Palestinians. So this was a good opportunity to work closely together also with Boycott from Within, which have a strong, who work very closely on this. So we published also a newspaper on Culturescapes. And there again, there you have the media. They do not really ask us, but we had a lot of media reports and photos and so on, so it was quite nice. And then you also could take the opportunity, if you have a football match, on our website we have a nice picture where once activists stepped on the football ground when there was a match between Basel and Haifa, I think. It's not possible anymore, it's like high security zones and cameras everywhere and so on, but okay, if ever there's opportunities, we have to take them. And nowadays we are in a campaign against drones because Switzerland on the one hand has close links to Israeli army, they are very proud of it and so on, and they want to buy drones in Israel. On the other hand, I mean, I'm not for drones from the States or drones from Germany, but it's not by chance, or it's interesting and important to address also the Israeli security and military industry, because it's really a big economic factor in this country. And so all the world today rushes to Israel and wants to buy all kind of military equipment. We produced this special issue on drones, and it's the campaign that we are dealing with until the end of the year, and then unfortunately they probably will buy the 6 drones from Israel. But okay, we do what we can to at least to raise the sensibility or the consciousness of people. Okay, I come to the end. For me, BDS was really like a big relief when for such a long period, if you did Palestinian solidarity work, there was not really a good campaign or a good partner on Palestinian side. And with this BDS call, really, you have a campaign which, in its analysis, in its logic, gives an answer to the whole system of repression that Israel has created. So it's an intelligent campaign, it addresses all the key questions, and it leaves a lot of space for every town, every country to do what they can in their specific context. It's not a campaign that gives solutions, but it fights for the preconditions of overcoming a regime and of discussing what kind of society would have to be created afterwards. And it's, of course, like in South Africa, once you overcome the regime, it's not that you reach social justice and equality at once, but it would be the preconditions to have the same rights for all and for all parts of the Palestinian people. So definitely I would be very happy if there would be some movement in Vienna or in Austria too, and I think there's a lot of possibilities also to coordinate campaigns or to help each other or to profit from the knowledge of the ones and of the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit, and without delay,
good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here in Vienna. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I think that it is very important on this occasion that we are marking pretty much the founding of the BDS group in Vienna, and to see so many faces here, both on the practical aspect and also on the symbolic aspect. We were just walking the other day on the steps of Herzl steps, and I think it is very symbolic that from the place where Zionism was conceived and given the backwind, we will also be able to bring about a change and question what Zionism is all about. So, a little about myself, you heard it, but I will say it in one line. My name is Ronnie, I'm a conscientious objector to military service. I'm part of the Palestinian popular struggle, which is joined by, the Palestinian popular struggle is being joined by conscientious Israelis and internationals in a joint non-violent struggle. Most importantly, it's a popular struggle coming from the people, and part of the Palestinian BDS campaign with a small Israeli group, a group of Israeli citizens and residents who wholeheartedly support the Palestinian call that Birgit was talking about, the Palestinian call for BDS. But I also have another way to present myself. That was the way that I would like to see myself, but there is also the way that the state of Israel sees me, and that would simply be that I'm a privileged Israeli Jew. More precisely, I'm a very privileged white male Israeli Jew. I can't control that. Now, it is important to understand that because these two are very, very much related. Since I am this person among the privileged, it means, once acknowledging that these privileges come on account of taking away the basic rights of the underprivileged, of the others, then obviously the question is, what do we do about it? And that is exactly what we do about it. We refuse to take part in the crime, we oppose it, and we call on the world to do the same. So I said that I'm an Israeli Jew. What does that mean? I carry an Israeli ID. In my identification card it says citizenship Israeli. But I do not have an Israeli nationality. There is no such thing. My nationality, according to that same piece of paper, says that my nationality is Jewish. My neighbor in Jaffa, who would be Palestinian, their nationality would be Arab. We are both Israeli citizens, but we do not have the same rights, starting off by not having the same nationality. Why is that so? If we go back to 48, and Birgit talked about it, but in 48, at the latest, what happened is that historic Palestine was about to be divided under a very unfair decision by the UN into two states, pretty much. But at that time, at the eve of 48, there were only 30% Jews living on that land. 30% ethnic Jews. And only 10% of the land was Jewish-owned. According to the UN partition plan, 56% of the land was supposed to be given to the 30% Jews. Most of them, by the way, were colonizers who came in quite recently to take over, to usurp, to take advantage of the land. Take advantage of the land and of the resources, including the human resources of the land. So that was an unfair decision. But that was not the main Palestinian tragedy, because what happened immediately afterwards is that those Zionists who founded the state insisted to have what they refer to as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, I don't know what that means. It's not a logical term. You cannot have a supremacist and a democracy, supremacist and a democratic state at the same time. Either you have equality or you don't have equality. But what that meant to them is that in order, if you create a Jewish majority, then you can claim that you have a democracy. And the first thing that happened was creating this Jewish majority by force. By sheer force, many people have been expelled. Many of the indigenous people of the land have been expelled from there. There were also acts of massacre and rapes and so on, but mainly by sheer force, people were kicked out of their homes. and Israel performed a premeditated act of ethnic cleansing. Between 7 and 800,000 people have been expelled from there and have been denied the right to return home ever since. Today, these people constitute about 70% of all Palestinians. About 70% are refugees. The next thing that happened after creating this artificially created Jewish majority was the attempt to maintain this majority at any cost. And then the first things that happened were actually establishing a system that will give preferential treatment to the select ethnic group that I belong to by taking away the basic rights of the others. Because not all the people were expelled from them, most of them were expelled, but some remained. So there were racist laws put in place from the very beginning. The law of return is one of them, trying to counter the right of return. There is the law of return, saying that any Jew around the world, ethnic Jew around the world, may come to Israel and get immediate citizenship. That is a law that is clearly racist by its definition, and had also to be amended several times because actually the Zionist state doesn't want all ethnic Jews, it only wants some of them, those that are more aligned with the politics of the state of Israel and so on, so they had to refine the law with time. Another law that was implemented quite early on is the citizenship law, which again is a racist law by excellence. I mean, it is clearly racist. And since then, there have been about 50 other laws that depend on these two laws. So we have a whole slew of laws in the Israeli legal system that are clearly racist. And they basically touch on almost every aspect of life of Palestinians. How do you do that? The best way to do it is simply by segregating the population. So Israel was founded on the basis of ethnic cleansing, creating the Jewish majority by force in a place where there wasn't one to begin with. And secondly, creating these segregated communities which have different sets of rights. By now, these days, there are many layers of groups that have, different groups that have each more or less rights according to their demographics. So the whole foundation of the State of Israel was founded on that, on everything that is opposed to values, to democratic values such as equality and rights of the minorities. It was founded on ethnic supremacy. It was founded on giving privileges to the select ethnic group. The next thing that happened after all of this was also the military occupation, the brutal military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. This happened in 1967. Up until today, we have the longest running military occupation in modern time, which is a very brutal one at that. So these three rights that we're talking about, that Birgit explained, one of them relates to the occupation of 67 that there is a consensus by now. There's an agreement around the world that this has to end. People deserve their basic rights. But the other two rights refer to the very foundation of the State of Israel, which was founded on the basics of, as I said, everything that is opposed to democracy. Okay? The inequality among Israeli citizens, and most importantly, denying the people of the land, the indigenous people of the land, the right to live there. And up to this day, many of them are refugees in refugee camps, not far away from their original places of residence. Most of them are only about 150 kilometers away from their original places. There are also, by the way, some refugees which are internal refugees. Israel is not even willing to recognize those who have left their homes, but still remained under Israeli control, so they did receive an Israeli citizenship. But they cannot go back to their original homes that they had before 48. This is all done under the guise of the law, under legal pretense. All these things are happening. So, when we look back at what has happened in recent years, In 2004, there was the ICJ, the decision of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which ruled very clearly that the whole of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem are occupied Palestinian territories. They ruled that every single settlement on these lands is illegal. And they ruled that every kilometer of the wall is illegal and has to be dismantled. And that was a unanimous decision. There was one vote that was a dissenting vote, and they said, the American judge said that if the wall is built for matters of security, then it could be regarded as illegal. Since then we know that the wall has nothing to do with security, it has everything to do with taking away as much land with as little Palestinians as possible. So all judges of the International Court of Justice ruled the same. It's no coincidence because international law is very clear about the situation. Israel acts in clear violation of international law. It absolutely disrespects and violates universally recognized human rights. And that was the decision of the court in 2004. Exactly a year later came Palestinian civil society's call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That call simply states that until Israel abides by its obligations under international law and respect of universally recognized human rights, that non-violent means of boycott, divestment, and sanctions have to be applied on the criminal apartheid state, occupying an apartheid state. Occupation in itself is not a crime under international law, but the type of occupation that Israel is performing, where rather than being obligated to the welfare of the people under its control, it actually violates their rights in every possible way, then that falls under belligerent occupation, and that is clearly criminal. And aside from that, Israel practices what is referred to as the crime of apartheid, which is a very serious crime. It is one of the few crimes that fall under the legal definition of, under the definition of crimes against humanity. Now, in the occupied territories, we have clear distinction. We have two different legal systems put in place. So, as was mentioned, if I participate in a demonstration and alongside with a Palestinian colleague and we get arrested, the consequences can be very different. Even though we were arrested at the same time, at the same place, doing the same thing, I spent 2 nights in jail and he spent a year and a half in jail. And that is a very common outcome of such a thing. If you have Palestinians living in the same territory as the privileged Jewish settlers, and they happen to have a car accident, the consequences would be very different. Because one would be under civilian law and would be dealt with the police and would have would see his lawyer and the judge and so on much sooner, and the judge would be a civilian judge and the court would be a civilian court, and the law would be civilian law, which is an apartheid law, but it is civilian law. But the Palestinian would be kept in custody for much longer until they see their attorney and then until they see the judge, and the judge will be a military judge in a military court under military law, and that military court has 99.7% conviction rate. So it would be very difficult for such Palestinians to actually get a fair trial. Okay, that's the case in the occupied territories, that's quite clear. The occupied territories also includes occupied East Jerusalem. Israel doesn't think that East Jerusalem, doesn't agree with the fact that East Jerusalem is occupied territory. They call it the United Jerusalem, even though this is one of the most segregated cities in the world. But it is clearly under international law, according to the 2004 ruling, this is occupied territory. That means that in all these areas, the West Bank, the East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, Israel has precisely and exactly 0 rights over that land. It only has obligation to its people. So when we later discuss all forms of solutions, and Israel comes up with all sorts of demands about borders and about land swaps and this and that, we have to remember that actually Israel is in no position to come up with any demands over these territories. It simply doesn't. It has no rights over these territories. If they have an offer to the Palestinians and the Palestinians accept that offer, that is wonderful, but the Palestinians are not obligated to accept any such offer for a land swap, for example. But apartheid does not only exist in the occupied territories, it also exists in Israel proper, what we refer to as Palestine 48. As I mentioned, the people, the indigenous people of that land have been kicked out of there. A deeply racist, supremacist legal system has been put in place. And it so happens that when I arrived here, I told you that my ID carries, it says citizenship Israeli, nationality Jewish. But when I arrived here, I used an Israeli passport, and my passport said that my nationality is Israeli. That is a lie. There is no such thing. And there was a group of Israelis, Israeli Jews. By the way, when we say Israelis, we only count the 80% Jewish population in Israel. That tells you something about Israel's society. It is a very exclusive society. So when we say Israeli, we do not count the others. A bunch of Israeli Jews appealed to the Israeli Supreme Court, which is the main vehicle of apartheid. It is the main apparatus that tries to legitimize the illegitimate. And that court had to rule about the question of their request to become Israeli, having an Israeli nationality. They said, we don't feel affiliated with a Jewish nationality. We live in Israel, we're Israeli. We want to have an Israeli nationality on our identification card. It was debated for quite a while, for many years, and eventually the Supreme Court declined that. And in its remarks, it was stated that basically acknowledging an Israeli nationality would undermine the very foundation of the State of Israel. That is a true statement. So first of all, it says that Israel is probably the only state that does not recognize its own nationality. And secondly, that apartheid court did say something right, that having an Israeli nationality would mean having some sort of a basis for equality, some sort of treating its citizens equally, and that would undermine everything that the state is all about. And I have to agree with that. For the same reason, there is also no constitution in Israel. Because again, constitution, even more than just nationality, would enshrine that people, all people of the land, all citizens at the very least, would receive equal treatment. And that would be detrimental to the Zionist project in Palestine. So earlier on, not Herzl was a racist by all accounts, but other Zionists earlier on may have wanted to live alongside with the indigenous people in Palestine, or not necessarily in Palestine. There were also attempts to build a Jewish homeland elsewhere. But at the very least, during the early waves of immigration to Palestine, it was already very clear about the nature of Zionism and the Zionist project that was to take place. So yes, Zionism was a colonialist project supported by the British, among others, where basically the colonizers came over to take the land, take the resources, and exploit the land, the resources, and the human resources. But another element of that project was not only that it was a colonialist project, it was an exclusive project. It said that this land is ours, the Jews, and only ours. And anyone who doesn't belong to that select group simply doesn't belong. They are not part of that, and will never be part of that. So, Ilan Pappé, for example, an Israeli historian, quotes people from the second wave of immigration, the second Aliyah. They used to write diaries. And they arrived quite poor, but very idealistic to Palestine at the time. And they believed in this notion of a state without people, for people, land without people, for people without land. And then they arrived. Lo and behold, they saw that there are people on that land. So that was already quite a tragic incident where they saw that there are people living there. But if there are people living there and their ideology says that that land is all theirs, then these people simply don't belong there. And in their diaries, they were hosted by the indigenous Palestinian people, and sometimes they were even taught how to work the land and so on. And in the diaries, they would write things like, "Tonight I'm staying at the house of this and this foreigner." So these new immigrants wrote about the indigenous people that they are the foreigners. And that type of thinking carries on to this very day. As I said, there are many laws that are explicitly racist or implicitly racist, that deny basic rights from the indigenous Palestinians. There are actually even places of residence, villages, for example in the Nakab Desert, which are not recognized by the state. Again, by all kinds of legal means, under the guise of the law, Israel refuses to recognize the legitimacy of these villages. And they have no running water, and no electricity, and no sewage. But their neighbors would have all of that, of course. Water and electricity and sewage. Now these villages, usually of Bedouin people in the Nakab Desert, but not only, they have been living there before the founding of the State of Israel. They are Israeli citizens, but they do not get these basic rights that every citizen should get. These days, there is actually a government plan called the Prager Plan, which the plan pretty much says that these 30,000 to 40,000 people, Bedouin people, should actually be sort of concentrated in a smaller area, right by the West Bank, just south of the West Bank. I can only imagine what plans there are for the future. And basically freeing the land from its indigenous people in order to obviously settle there the wanted people, not the unwanted people. So that type of thinking hasn't stopped for one day since the foundation of the State of Israel, or even before that. And the ethnic cleansing, which started by sheer force in 1948, carries on today under the guise of the law, under the direction or the approval of the Israeli Supreme Court. So when we talk about apartheid, we do not only refer to the crime of apartheid in occupied Palestinian territories, we refer to the crime of apartheid which is taking place throughout historic Palestine, both in the land occupied in 1967 and in the land occupied or controlled in 1948. What do we do as privileged dissidents? There are a few dissidents, not that many. But being the privileged, it means I also carry more of a responsibility. I can say certain things that other people can't. And our group, in short, is called Boycott from Within, but the full name would be Boycott Supporting the Palestinian BDS Call from Within. Long name. But the idea is that it is not about us, the privileged, supporting the boycott. It is us, the privileged people under apartheid, supporting the underprivileged in their just struggle against oppression and so on. Later on, the Israeli state started also responding to that quite a bit. And we see that the BDS campaign has basically managed to put together all these three Palestinian rights in a way that is very coherent. It is the first time probably that these three rights are being addressed as one element, because we have Palestinians living in different places. Some are living in the occupied territories of 1967, some are citizens of the State of Israel, and some are refugees who have been denied the right to come back home ever since the foundation of the state. But these all belong needless to say, to one group, and each is suffering in their own way. Israel is very good at divide and conquer and giving different sets of rights or taking away less rights or more rights according to these different groups. And as I said, there is a whole structure, layered structure of how many rights each group has. But we have to remember that this type of thinking that I just explained has it manifests itself in different ways, but it is the same type of thinking, whether they are the Bedouin people who are Israeli citizens but are denied rights, or whether they are living under military occupation, or whether they are not even allowed to come back home. So the wonderful thing that we achieved by the BDS campaign is, first of all, that we managed to frame this into one coherent demand. Secondly, since the BDS campaign is a rights-based approach, it talks about the rights, and these rights are absolute. They're fundamental rights of these people. I do not agree to have half equality on that land, or three-quarters equality. We should have equality. The people of that land, the indigenous people, have rights as refugees. And these rights are personal rights, by the way. How do we implement the rights? That's a different question. So, the BDS campaign has a rights-based approach, as opposed to a solution-based approach. And we do not take a position about whether it will be implemented in a one-state form, or a two-state, or a confederation, or anything of that sort, as long as these three fundamental rights will be respected. By doing that, basically, we have managed to change the whole discourse about Israel. 10 years ago, more or less, the media and the people of the world were pretty much talking about Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. Even though it's not a democracy, it never was one, not even to begin with. Then, roughly 5 years ago, they started talking about it as a democracy minus, a flawed democracy. And nowadays, we hear pretty much all over the world discussions about Israel as what it is, which is a criminal apartheid state. We even heard it recently from John Kerry, the American representative, which obviously does not mean the same thing when he says apartheid. He's working very hard in order to protect Israeli apartheid, but this has reached the ears of the people in power. And that is very important. That's a very encouraging sign. Because the only reason that this can carry on to this day, the military occupation since 1967, and there is consensus about it, that it has to end, there's no question about it, and it still carries on. And also the other crimes, those that started in 1948. The only reason that they can carry on to this day is because Israel doesn't have to pay the price. It has full impunity in the world. It receives impunity, obviously, from the US and Canada, but also from the EU, from every member state of the EU. I had the misfortune of spending 3 months at the European Parliament, and I saw it from up close. And there is one example of many about how European parliamentarians play along with that and carry on lending impunity to Israel. And that is the EU-Israel Association Agreement, the trade agreement with Israel. In that trade agreement, there is a binding clause. The second article of the agreement says that if there is a consistent human rights violation in Israel, and there is, as we know, then the agreement cannot carry on. It has to be frozen. It can be frozen. There can be corrective measures taking place, like sanctions or boycotts and so on. But one thing that cannot happen is to carry on with this agreement, to carry on with business as usual with Israel. What happens on the ground is that every member state of the EU chooses to disregard not only international law, they choose to disregard their own European law in order to protect Israel and carry on with business as usual. That is why, luckily, as opposed to the powers that be, the US, Canada, EU, Australia, and so on, the people of these countries are starting to speak up. And there is right now a public outcry against this type of activity, against protecting the protectionism of Israel. And And the BDS campaign by now, starting in 2005, being a modest Palestinian call for the people of the world, by now it has become a global awareness movement, even greater than the whole issue of Palestine. And throughout the world we have more and more groups acting in a decentralized fashion, but abiding by these principles that we demand in these three fundamental rights that have to be respected. And by now we have this public outcry against the criminal policies of the State of Israel. We are saying enough is enough. We're not going to carry on with that. And that is very important. So BDS is also, in a sense, a grounds up movement. We're talking about boycotts, which is something that every one of us can do, whether it's financial, economic boycott, or cultural, or academic, or sports, and so on. And there are clear guidelines about also what we boycott, what we not boycott. We can talk a little about that. And then there is divestment, which is, let's say, if I have a pension fund and my pension fund invests in such companies that are acting in complicity, that are complicit with Israeli violations, then I can go to that pension fund and ask them, please do not invest in such companies. Divest, disinvest from these companies and invest in a socially responsible type of way. Or if I'm a student at university and my university is investing in such companies, I can go and say, please do not invest in such companies, and so on. So boycott is something that is common, that everyone can do. Each obviously to their own ability in the different contexts in different countries that they live in. And then divestment is something that usually a body that is invested in such companies will choose to disinvest and to invest in a different way, in a socially responsible way. And finally, sanctions, which is something that an international body can do, like the EU, like the UN, and so on. If they had done their part, if the politicians had done their part, or if the sanctions were taking place, probably we wouldn't need all the rest. But what is happening is that, first, this is coming from the people, we see how this is already influencing the business community, and eventually it will also trickle out to the politicians. And this is happening. I mentioned that the discourse about Israel is changing around the world. Israel has legislated a law, basically making it illegal for people like myself to speak about boycott. That was in July 2011, a very draconian law against Israeli citizens, saying that anyone who encourages or promotes boycott of any sort, as long as it is a politically motivated boycott of Israel, is acting illegally. Initially they wanted it to be a criminal offense, eventually it was a civilian offense. Initially they wanted it to be enacted 1 year retroactively, which is absolutely absurd. Eventually they have softened it, so it is not active retroactively. But still it is illegal for me to promote boycott. One of the main bodies that reacted to this, that were very unhappy with this legislation, was AIPAC, the Israel lobby in the US, because they understand how badly that makes Israel look. Because this is going against everything that we believe in, like freedom of expression and political organizing and so on. So in a sense, that law is a very good sign showing just how dire the situation is for the supremacist state of Israel, and how they are acting in such a gross manner and exposing how they have no respect for such values that we hold dear. Another example is that the BDS campaign was initially under the supervision of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they did all sorts of acts of propaganda. They invested a lot of money, a lot of energy in trying to counter BDS. Instead of simply abiding by their obligation and respecting rights for everyone, they choose to invest all this money and energy in order to convince the world that this is not the case. And they are sending all sorts of cultural figures to represent Israel, to divert the attention, or to do what we call whitewashing of Israeli crimes. And all these cultural figures also like the example that you have here of the Tel Aviv Beach, 2010 Tel Aviv Beach, is just one example of how they try to divert the attention and show a different face of Israel. Sell Israel in a nicer package. But if you open the package, you will see the same thing inside. You will see supremacy in every corner. And these people who go to represent the criminal apartheid state of Israel are usually sent with being sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They would usually participate in festivals that are organized by the Foreign Affairs Ministry or the Embassy or that sort of organizations. And for that reason, they should be boycotted. Not because they're Israeli. And we have clear guidelines in the BDS call, which is a very responsible call, about what we boycott and what we not boycott. We do not boycott Israelis simply because they are from Israel. We will boycott anyone who takes upon themselves to represent, who is an official representative of the state. Or in that case, the way that they are referred to is that they are cultural ambassadors of the state. For that, they should be boycotted. Same goes for academic boycott. People have this notion that academic boycott goes against academic freedom. This is not the case. We have clear guidelines about how do we boycott. The boycott is not against Israeli academics, period. The boycott is against Israeli academic institutions. Every single academic institution in Israel is complicit in many ways. You have 2 universities that have a military base on campus. You have courses that are specifically given to military personnel. You have research funding that is given by the Ministry of Defense. You have legal departments that are very busy trying to legitimize the illegitimate, trying to legitimize Israeli violations of international law and so on. And there are many, many such examples. For that reason, every single Israeli academic institution is complicit and should not be given legitimacy. It does not mean that academics cannot cooperate. What we're calling for is for the severance of ties, for the cutting of ties between academic institutions here and academic institutions in Israel. And this thing touches on much more than just the occupation of 67. It touches on the very character of the state of Israel. Because once we boycott cultural figures, or once we boycott academic institutions, these are representatives of the state. And this type of boycott is more pretty much at the symbolic level. The Israeli economy, by the way, is very strong. The economic boycott is a very important tool. But that touches on one aspect, which is the economy. But when we boycott, when we hold a cultural or an academic boycott, we send a message about the very illegal nature of the Zionist state. And that is something that that state has nothing, they have no response for that. So they're trying to divert the attention, and we have to be aware of that. Recently, dealing with the BDS campaign was moved from the responsibility of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. So now this is regarded as a strategic threat on Israel. And what's very important to understand is that even inside Israel, people do not like the boycott. They definitely don't like it. They also don't understand the call for boycott. But they talk about it all the time. In the mainstream media, on TV, in satire shows, wherever you go, politicians, even in the election campaign, they have been using the boycott in order to convince their electorate one way or another. So definitely, this is touching a nerve. I do not know if that is enough, but we are definitely making a change in the way that Israelis perceive themselves and in the way that the international audience perceives Israel. And that is something very encouraging, because nothing has been changing in the last 70 years or 60 years. But very much has been changing in the past 10 years or so. And I would attribute a lot of that to the BDS campaign, which has been doing a tremendous job about changing the whole discourse. It's not the question of one state or two states, and each one of us has a view about how many states and in what format. But what is important is about challenging the very character of the state and insisting that that state, call it by whatever name and have whatever flag on it, that it will be an inclusive state for all its people and respecting values such as freedom, justice, and equality for all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Thank you, Birgit. We can open the discussion, so if there are any questions from the audience or contributions, so just... Okay, so I will start the first question, perhaps, to both of you. While BDS has many supporters, such as Richard Falk, Desmond Tutu, Ken Loach, Naomi Klein, Aaron Gataro, prominent supporters also, or even Judith Butler. And BDS claims for themselves also that the BDS campaign has successes. There are, of course, also critics on BDS, even on the side of those who are engaged in the Palestinian cause, like Noam Chomsky or Finkelstein. They say that I have a quote: that the BDS campaign harms the whole movement. It harms the Palestinians and is a gift to the Israeli hardliners and their American supporters, and it undermines all agreements of the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. What would be your answers about this sort of arguments mainly from the side of those who are with the Palestinian cause?
Maybe shortly, maybe Noam Chomsky or Finkelstein, they are in some parts with the Palestinian cause, but not in all aspects. And maybe it's exactly on the line of including or being inclusive in sense of integrating the rights of the refugees, or the question of the rights or equal rights of Palestinians inside Israel, that they do not agree. I guess there's a lot of discussion or a lot of hesitation maybe by part of liberal Jews supporting parts of Palestinian rights, but still stuck to kind of discourse of Jewish character of the state and wanting to conceive some part or to save some part of this concept of a Jewish state. And I also think it's kind of anachronistic concept of society to, if you want to link it to the ethnicity or religious character. And as much as everyone can decide on his own how he or she defines her identity, it should definitely not be linked to any kind or set of rights. So the fight is to be fought here. Which kind of rights would you defend?
First off, BDS stands for very basic rights of people. As I said, equality, freedom, justice. I don't think it's a big issue. I think it's pretty much a first elementary step, given the situation. But what we have, especially coming from inside Israel, is that we have those who are what are regarded as right-wing Zionists, who are explicitly racist or fascist, and they say something like, this whole land is ours, and we don't care about the rights of the Palestinians. Okay, and it is pretty clear where they stand. We also have another type of Zionists, which are what is regarded as liberal Zionists, or Zionist left, even though there is no left in Israel, and never was. there are a handful of dissidents. That's what we have. But those people on the Zionist left, they speak a very different language. They speak the language of peace, the language of human rights. And they say, no, we want to give Palestinians some rights. We want to give them even some sort of a state. It doesn't matter that that state will not have, will not be a viable state and so on. But we want to give them some state, we want to give them some right, as long as it doesn't harm, as long as it doesn't take away from our privilege in this land. So they, at the very essence of it, they don't want to get off their high horse. They don't want to have equality among all the people of their land, of the land. So what they say is, we don't want a big state of Israel. We don't want the whole land and carry on occupying the Palestinian people. We want the small land that will be free of Arabs, not the big land that will be free of Arabs. And that type of thinking does not only relate to politicians and so on. You have all sorts of organizations that have human rights in their name who speak that language. For example, you have the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, which claims to be a human rights organization, and which published in 2007 a report titled A Democracy on Paper. And this is a 7-page report, and basically they question whether Israel is indeed a democracy. And the whole paper deals with the issue of the occupation of 67, and indeed the conclusion is that Israel is not a democracy in the occupied territories of 67, which is quite clear. But there is also one interesting paragraph on the first page, and it says something like this. They acknowledge that Israel has a discriminatory nature, both by law and in practice, which is based on ethnicity, and that type of discrimination makes Israel a unique case among Western countries. The next line says that, understanding that, this is not for the scope of this paper. This discussion is not for the scope of this paper. So when they come to question whether Israel is a democracy, they perfectly well know that Israel is no democracy in the occupied territories of 67. But with regard to what is happening inside, they acknowledge that there is inherent discrimination in every possible way. That the very legal system is such, and at the same time, they not only refuse to deal with it, they have perfected this language that is full of, they brought this discourse which is based on lies into an art form, talking about the strong basis of Israeli democracy, protecting Israeli democracy, fighting for democracy. And these people basically are the ones who carry this sense of legitimacy, and they will talk about the peace camp and help the peace camp help Israel, save Israel from itself, and so on. Well, we have to remember that actually that very type of thinking that tries to legitimize all sorts of demographic issues, tries to legitimize that Jewish character of the state of Israel, is illegitimate to the core. So yes, when politicians go and discuss with, when Netanyahu says that he will only negotiate with the Palestinians if the Palestinians acknowledge Israel's right to be a Jewish state, then obviously I don't expect the Palestinians to acknowledge that, but I don't expect anyone in their right mind to acknowledge Israel's right to be a Jewish state, because it is not a Jewish state by religion. Zionism is a secular movement, an anti-religious movement. It treated the ultra-Orthodox of Europe in the most racist manner. It is secular in every possible way, but what it is Jewish in the ethnic sense, in the supremacist sense. And that is the only way that it is Jewish. So basically, no country has a right to be a supremacist state, and that includes the state of Israel. And that relates to the question about people who I do not necessarily regard as Zionists, people who I have the highest respect for, like Chomsky and Finkelstein. But whenever they talk about these very issues, they make a detour. They will never address that point. And basically, as if this is not an issue that we have to discuss. So we can discuss the occupation of 67, we may discuss the issue of the refugees, but we cannot discuss the very character of the state, the very supremacist character of the state. Once we acknowledge that this is the character of the state, then obviously there is no question that anything less than equality, anything less than an inclusive character rather than an exclusive character of the state is simply not enough. Will simply not yield a solution, not in the long run. And it doesn't matter if this is in 2 states or 1 state or in any other form.
Thank you. Okay, please.
I'll just start. So I was promoting this event on my Facebook page and was excited about the comments because it's always interesting when this topic starts. So actually I have 2 questions. The first comment was, the components in the technology you used to make this post were developed in Israel. I just accepted that because I have no idea. So if you know something about that, maybe you can tell me. And my friend said, yeah, see you there. The end of injustice will come. And the same guy from the first comment said, I admire your wish to see injustice end, but if you wish to find injustice, I recommend looking towards Syria, Sudan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian territories, and other places before looking at Israel. If you think Israel is the place to best fight injustice, you're sadly misinformed. And I don't know, my words come to an end because I get so angry, I don't know what to respond. So maybe you have some input for me.
So let's start with the last question. Why before? Why do we have to leave Israel to last? It's already had 70 years of impunity. Why does it need to have any more? Israel is clearly a criminal state. It acts in violation of most laws under international law. It acts in violation of the treaties that it is signed upon. It violates also agreements that it has with Palestinians and so on. So I think the case for acting against its criminal action is clear. The whole issue about raising Syria and any other place that is acting in a horrible criminal fashion is just a diversion. It's just a distraction. Yes, we should definitely act against the crimes taking place in Syria. Absolutely. Many of the people who are hurt and who are the most impoverished and lacking basic rights are actually Palestinian refugees there. But we should act against every criminal regime, including the state of Israel. The difference is that when we talk about North Korea, the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea, then people understand that maybe there would be a reason to sanction or take action against that. But when we talk about the Jewish Democratic State of Israel, which is just as democratic, then all of a sudden that state is to be treated in a different way. And what we're saying is, and what the BDS campaign is saying, is that Israel should be treated just like any other state, no more, no less. And that would be enough to change, to transform in its totality the whole situation. That's about the first question, the second question, sorry. And the first question about all sorts of things that are being developed in Israel, and yes, it has a lot of technological advancements. We mentioned also the weapons, and Israel is, yes, it's leading in research and technology and so on. It is also leading in arms trade, which is very technology intensive, by the way. And Israel is a leading arms exporter because, and they say it with no shame, that they can sell weapons because they have actually tried them, tested them on real people. So they have the edge. But going back to the technology, yes, there is in Israel technology in the cell phone and pretty much in many other things that we use on a daily basis. The BDS campaign doesn't call for that. It also doesn't call on me, being an Israeli citizen, to not purchase at the supermarket or not to go to university. Because that is, as I mentioned, first of all, there are clear guidelines about what is expected, but secondly, it is not about that. It is about sending a clear message and not taking part in crime. Saying no to business as usual and not taking part in crime. Now, I'll give you one of many examples. Being an Israeli citizen, let's say if I was a filmmaker, for example, there would be no problem for me as a filmmaker to use funds, even funds by the Ministry of Culture, in order to produce a film. But it would be absolutely unacceptable to receive funds from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to produce the same film. If I receive funds and that money has ties, has political ties associated with it, then that would be unacceptable. But it is understood that being a tax-paying citizen, I am entitled to certain rights and to receive certain services from the state. So it is not about boycotting myself or not buying in the supermarket. It is about driving a clear message about the criminality, the criminal fashion of the State of Israel, and putting an end to that crime.
In practical terms, if you want to make a campaign, two things. One, about the technology, Israeli technology. I think we do not look for the 100% pure campaign that should tackle every aspect of Israeli presence in the world. That's not an aim. It's not at all what we want. We want to find targets where we can make a difference. And maybe there is also all kind of targets which are too difficult. So why to start with difficult parts if you have other targets where you can convince people, where you can achieve something. So I think the choice of the good targets is one aspect. And I mean, there are, all those who work in this campaign, they have received all these kind of letters from people and there were films made, and I guess it was the Israeli Foreign Ministry or Strategic Ministry with this kind of stupid films where they show you if you want to boycott Israel, you should not use any more medicine or the generic. Their Israel is very strong, so you would die, you could not use all kind of technology. It's a stupid kind of way of also supremacy to some extent. If you don't use Israeli products, you would not be able to live. To some extent, this is the message. And I think we don't have any interest to enter into this kind of quite stupid discussion, but rather think about which targets we choose and where we can achieve something. That's the one thing. And also in practical terms, if you are responsible for, let's say, the emailing of your campaign, you would not start answering all these kind of comments because it's a use of time. You can. What is interesting is people who have real questions, who really question themselves and who want to have arguments. But it's really not a need to answer to all those convinced Zionists or whatever, or people who maybe even students that are engaged now in this anti-BDS campaign to write emails and letters and so on. It's really a waste of time. So I think it's also kind of tactical answer, whether you answer someone or whether you take it for serious or it's just a kind of this propaganda game and you look who has the better arguments and so on. It's not a name in itself to be the better to be better in propaganda arguments. Also, even for other questions, if you go and collect signatures and then you find someone who wants to talk half an hour and it does not give any new elements and so on, it's a waste of time also in the sense of the possibility to convince others to support your campaign. So you would choose where you want to answer and where not.
Okay, the second question here.
Actually, two questions. One is more from curiosity. You talked about the right of return for the Jewish. What does it actually look like in detail? Do you know a bit more about it? How is it determined whether somebody is a Jew or not? You just said that some are preferred. They do want some Jews, but not others. So what if you know a bit more about that? And the other question, this distinction, this clear distinction, which seems to be so easy between Jews and Arabs, like Jewish and Arab nationality. How is it actually done? And doesn't that create a lot of problems in practical life? How do you actually, aren't there a lot of cases in between? That's the second question.
So these two are quite related because basically Israel defines who is a Jew, which has nothing to do with the religious aspect of who is Jewish. Absolutely. Nothing to do, they're mutually exclusive. As I mentioned, Zionism was very much against the ultra-Orthodox and still is. These days there are very big demonstrations of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel and also abroad against forced conscription to the Israeli army. They see it as nothing less than a holy war, like a holy, that basically the state of Israel is trying to harm and to get rid of their Jewish identity by force, by not allowing them to go and study in the yeshiva and so on. And indeed, for those ultra-Orthodox, there are different views there, but for those who are anti-Zionist, either they are anti-Zionist or they are non-Zionist. For those who are anti-Zionist, they see Zionism as the greatest threat for Judaism. So I said all this just to explain that the way that Zionism looks at Judaism is not from the religious angle. They define it according to lineage, according to the mother and the grandmother.
The mother?
Yes. But that also caused some problems. Yes. It reminds us of other societies that define who's a Jew and so on. But they also arrived at all sorts of questionable cases where indeed it is not always clear. And that issue of the law of return was taken to court several times in all sorts of cases. For example, when there was someone who was born a Jew but converted to Christianity and wanted to come in under the law of return, he is still a Jew under that definition, and he should be able to get citizenship. But he was also a Christian. That was a little tricky for the state. So they had to redefine the law and so on. So there were some issues, and it's very interesting to read about that. There is a wonderful book called The Un-Jewish State by Akiva Or, who passed away recently. He was a wonderful activist and thinker, one of the founders of Matzpen, which was an anti-Zionist group in the 60s, a small group but very vocal. And yes, all his books are available online for free, Akiva Or, you can look it up. About the other question about how to differentiate and so on. So Israel differentiates pretty much according to what I said. Now they have this type of definition of who is Jewish, but basically that mostly applies to those who come from abroad and seek citizenship. There is no way to gain citizenship other than by being Jewish. I mean, those Palestinians who they can transfer their citizenship to their children, those Palestinians in 48, in what is regarded as Israel proper, but no other Palestinian can do that. No other Palestinian or no other non-Jew can come in and claim, seek what's called naturalization, kind of seek to become a citizen in the future.
So
it is not defined by law, the way that such a thing can happen.
So I couldn't become an Israeli citizen if I want.
Unless they make an exception, and they do make exceptions once in a while. Now, pretty much the only way you can do it is if you marry a Jewish citizen.
But
Jewish citizen.
But then I also have to assume the Jewish faith.
It becomes more and more tricky. You're right, because in order to marry, for example, Israel, in order to marry inside Israel, you can only marry according to in a religious wedding. So Jews can only marry in a Jewish wedding, and Muslims only in a Muslim wedding, and so on. Israel also practices Sharia law in that sense, because they practice, you have according to marriage and divorce, there is a different tribunal, kind of, a different court system that deals with that. And it is all not because Israel cares much about the religious aspect, as I mentioned before, but that is a way in order to keep things segregated. And there are exceptions. All the time there are exceptions, but these are the rule is quite clear. I can elaborate, but that's pretty much it for now, because the rest are nuances. So, and legally there's always nuances. But
so it is faith in the end. It is the faith.
No, it is what Israel means as being of the Jewish nationality. I am not religious. Israel claims I am of a Jewish nationality.
So if I want to immigrate, for example, and I claim my grandmother was Jewish, how can I prove that? I can just say I know that my grandmother was Jewish.
So in that case,
you
can get
Just wanted to come back to the question of North Korea and so on. In former years, it was the question about Chechnya. We often were asked if we don't why we don't do something on Chechnya and so on. And it's interesting for me also in practical terms. Many of those who support the BDS campaign or the Palestinian solidarity work, they are engaged in so many other campaigns. Many of them work for refugees from other countries, or they work also for social questions and so on. In fact, those who support this work, they often are quite politicized people who do a lot of other campaigns too, but never when you meet someone who works for the ecology issue, they would be asked, so why do you work in this and not in, let's say, housing? Or I don't know what, it's really the only kind of repeated argument when it comes to Israel. So this is really something that we have heard so often. You can ask the people, those who ask you, normally they only defend Israel and they are not engaged in any other political work.
What I also think is that Israel claims to be a democracy and still has this inequality. So that's what drives me crazy, actually, because about North Korea we know it's a dictatorship. I mean, it claims to be a dictatorship.
It's double standard in this specific case, yes, which is also a very clear thing.
Okay. Yeah?
Sorry, just one line.
Okay,
Israeli propaganda, what we call hasbara, did a very good job. And I would argue that the main achievement of Israeli propaganda is to convince the world that the situation is complicated. It is far from being complicated. It is very harsh, it is very brutal, it is not complicated. You have the colonizers and the colonized, the apartheid people and the ones who are subjugated under apartheid, the privileged and the underprivileged. That's what we have, and that's what we're dealing with. And another achievement is actually not only convincing the world that it is so complicated that you should not say anything about it and should not question too much, but also convincing the world that it has all this legitimacy, which unfortunately it doesn't. It was founded on that basis of denying the basic rights of the indigenous people and making sure that that will remain the case. So, the General Security Service in Israel, which is supposed to deal with security issues, stated in court that they are monitoring anyone who is working against the Jewish character of the state, even if they do it legally. Someone like myself calling for democracy or equality will be monitored simply because I question the very supremacist character of the state, the whole question of Jewish majority. That is regarded as a security issue in Israel. That tells you something about Israeli democracy.
There was a question here before.
Yeah, what do the Israelis think about Palestinians, and because they see the situation and they see who the victim is, and they can't deny it, because even when the media is telling them something different, they see the truth. So what do they say about it? What do they teach the children in school about the situation?
Who?
The Israelis.
Israeli society is a very racist, militaristic, chauvinistic society. And children are being raised to be soldiers from kindergarten, literally from kindergarten. Now, I don't think that the brainwashing is so... it is quite a subtle form of brainwashing, but it is always there. Through ceremonies, through different things that are being said or not being said, through the thinking that Israel is a small country surrounded by enemies and it, offers its hand for peace and so on, when actually the facts on the ground are exactly the opposite. And then as children grow up, so when they're in kindergarten, they send sweets to the soldiers in the front, and they are used to having all sorts of military-related elements in their upbringing, and obviously sometimes at home they would have the older brother or whatever, the soldier who is being worshipped pretty much. By the way, Israel may be regarded as a religious state, just that its religion is the military. And then later on, in school or in high school, you would see female soldiers female soldier teachers. Teachers on uniform being sent by the army, usually good-looking women, very representative, and they would go and teach in the school. And it doesn't really matter what they teach, they act as substitute teachers, but their very presence there is an act of indoctrination, by definition, yes. And children or teenagers understand that this is the way things should be. And also questioning it is very difficult. Stepping out of that.
But they see that it's not right, because when they have just to open their eyes and they see that they are not the victims, because...
Unfortunately, they don't. Unfortunately, they still think that they are the victims and that the whole world is anti-Semitic and all of that. Now, when Israel carried out the massacre in Gaza in 2008-2009, 95% of Israeli population, again, when I say Israeli, I only mean Israeli Jews. We never count the non-Jews as Israeli. So 95% of Israeli society supported the massacre as it was happening. Pretty much the same number, maybe 90%, supported it also in retrospect, after they learned about the atrocities that took place. After they learned about the bombing of kindergartens and all the horrible, horrible stories that took place in Gaza. That tells you something about Israeli society. So the change, being an optimist but also a realist, I don't think that the change will come from within.
So what do you think about the Palestinians?
Yes, yes. Ah, no, not me, but what Israelis think about Palestinians, yes. Yes. They, you know that, first of all, soldiers, but not only soldiers, see children in Gaza as potential terrorists. And they have no shame in saying that. When I was working in high-tech in the past, and I arrived at the office during the massacre of Gaza, and I'm also obviously very political, and I would show up with a hata or something like that. And then my colleague arrived, and he just dropped his little child in the kindergarten, and there was just a bombing of a kindergarten that morning. And we talked, and he said yes. He just took his child his little daughter to the kindergarten, and he told me, yes, I don't mind. Let them bomb all kindergartens in Gaza. I have no response to that. That's a very sick type of thinking. And unfortunately, the Israel government and all of its governments, because there was very little difference between its governments, Israeli governments represent the society, unfortunately. And that government is responsible for a situation where 95% of the water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. It's toxic. Now, you could say that this is a humanitarian crisis, that 95% of the water is toxic, but there were actually people who sat in an air-conditioned office, probably the Ministry of Defense, and thought about this, and realized that this should be the case. And the same type of people, they made plans with formulas, counting how many calories each person in Gaza should be allowed to eat. They have formulas, and they even made adjustments to these formulas, saying that, Palestinians, they don't need so much, because they have a different diet, they don't need so much fresh fruit and vegetables, they need more sugar and white flour and oil. That's all in the formulas. Now, Israel says that they haven't implemented it, that it was just kind of a plan. It doesn't matter if they implemented it or not. That is the type of thinking of the military, of the government, and unfortunately, it is very much accepted by its people.
I appreciate very much this evening the practical approach and steps you have taken in Switzerland, the best practice. And it's most important that you don't discuss secondary things, one or two states or whatever, but really at the roots of the problem. And you speak it out at the risk of you paying for it. But I'm concerned that we have a nice evening, but without results. Really, I'm concerned how this movement in Austria, BDS Switzerland, BDS from inside, but BDS from here, and what steps or how do we go about in networking to become efficient. You said, I don't think you will learn from themselves. I'm an old guy, very old, but I have a witness that the people of apartheid in South Africa, who refused absolutely to learn, did learn once the price for maintaining apartheid got too high. Therefore, I'm really convinced by experience, with all the price people pay, that it's very urgent to increase the price rapidly and all over European member states. And we have to do is that our problem is we do what they want. They want us to be divided, isolated, working everyone in its own thing. Not, yes, they enjoy it when we don't cooperate amongst ourselves. So really, I appeal to everybody who is here. I appreciate Magda Seewald from Wien Institute. They are really since years making the team an issue. But the practical implementation, they can do that. But we don't collaborate enough. So I ask really, use this opportunity tonight, and as I heard tomorrow there is a workshop going on, really to make it efficient. Otherwise I'm very sad.
I would like, you also present your plans, but I think there is quite good coordination between the campaigns in the different countries in Europe and worldwide. There is some specific list for specific parts of the campaign, and there is an exchange. I think we will not have problems to get information and help each other. So you would draft the campaign in Austria, and we will continue to be in exchange. I don't have a problem, or I'm not pessimistic in that sense. And
no, still, I feel even here in Austria, my friend in Norway, he's still here, the women in black, they're doing a good job.
Yeah.
But there's missing something horizontally linking one another, complementing one another. That is missing.
Yeah.
There are good things, as you said.
Yes.
But what really insults me when we are going each one our way and we don't do enough to coordinate.
Yeah.
That is really
the
challenge.
That is the challenge.
But in Switzerland, for instance, the people who support BDS campaign, they come from different backgrounds and different associations, and they are quite well coordinated. So sometimes maybe those who draft the campaign and who think about targets and who do the writing and so on, maybe it's a few people. But when we come to make like a mobilization, then we have all the other associations that also work in Palestinian solidarity campaigns. And I think it's possible, and you would find your way to do this. And I think really the step forward with the BDS campaign is that you don't only answer for urgencies. It's, if you look in the TV or in the internet about what's happening in the country, it's all the time urgencies in every respect, and it's like injustice in every respect. So everyone is jumping in. Just now I read about many people in Switzerland supported this Tent of Nations. Some might know. Now they destroyed 1,500 trees yesterday and so on. So urgency and so on. But I think it's really important to have this kind of campaign in mind that has like a perspective for the next several years. I don't know how long it will take, but I'm quite optimistic that the price will get quite high for Israel.
But I really ask for these people here, otherwise we stay on the level of discussion. Really we can do
you're right, it's up to us and up to you.
Young people.
I think you're right, there are many groups also in Vienna or in Austria who are working on solidarity for Palestine. And this BDS movement, which is a worldwide international movement, could be a chance for our groups, also in Vienna, to join the BDS movement together. So this is not, especially it's in Dalej Loop, this is because of the rooms, but this is not a matter of Dalej Loop, it's an international worldwide campaign. And any group who are working in Vienna can join this BDS. So, and BDS Austria could join the international movement of BDS. So this is the first step, I think. Hopefully.
We can. But what is foreseen concretely, even those people who are present here? I know we can.
We will see. Tomorrow, as you said, tomorrow is a workshop.
How is the workshop?
The workshop is at 2 p.m. with Birgit. Unfortunately, Ronnie has not the time. He has to go to Amsterdam tomorrow, but we will meet here at 2 p.m. and talk about concrete steps, how to make BDS in Austria, how to make BDS as a movement.
I will say something short. I absolutely agree with everything that you said. We have to also remember that in South Africa, it took close to 30 years until BDS became what it became, until it became worldwide in the consensus. We are active for less than 10 years. And in that short period of time, we managed to see quite a lot of changes happening. It's not enough, but it seems like we're heading in the right direction. But absolutely it is dependent on you just as much as it is on me. Because that's what we have, but that's quite a lot. We have the global community, and this is a decentralized effort by all people of the world. people have this notion that BDS, you know, is like boycott is no, no, no. Like it's very negative, but actually it's a very positive campaign. We are all the time finding new ways to communicate and new ways to work together. And to work together in a positive way, not to legitimize, as we said, the illegitimate, but actually to find ways to bring something that we believe in, that is worthy and beneficial to everyone in Palestine. So yes, there is reason for optimism.
Thank you.
Yes, please, the young lady in the corner.
I would like to know how the Israelis are treating you. Are they not talking with you, or are they laughing at you, or isn't that such a big? I mean, how are they treating you?
You mean in Israel?
Or people
Okay.
like you who are with, who are for the Palestinians and who are who are fighting for equality.
So what does it mean to be a BDS activist inside Israel?
Yeah, and if you and because you are an Israeli Jew by definition, what does it mean for? I mean, how is it?
Thanks. So, saying to people in Israel that I'm a conscientious objector, objecting military service, usually one of the first responses would be, so why do you live here? Because if I don't serve in the army, I don't really earn the right to live there. And that also works well against the ultra-Orthodox who do not serve in the army, against the Palestinians who do not serve in the army, and so on. So kind of also delegitimizing them. But the whole society is very, very militaristic. For the same reason, speaking about human rights in Israel is like cursing. It's like, there is actually a common phrase saying when usually right-wing people, but many people in Israel would say something like, you're a pure soul, you're a good soul, in a bad connotation. Like you're too good, you have to fight for whatever. You can't just, speak about human rights. That's not being perceived well in Israel. And everything about Israel, including the Israeli economy, is profiting from the exploitation and occupation of other people. I mentioned the arms trade, and basically we can see that peace is not profitable for Israel. And the Israeli society demonstrates it. That they don't think of peace as something that is beneficial for them. It's all under the context of, under the framing of, is it beneficial for the Jews? Is it beneficial for that select ethnic group? Rather than, is it beneficial for everyone? So we have to change the whole discourse in Israel. And as for myself, I feel like a dissident, like an outsider, and I'm used to it. It's not a big deal. I mean, and also, yes, there are some things, sometimes it's unpleasant, but usually I am still a privilege. So it's still quite okay for me. But I do live in a society that is very much a fascist society. Absolutely.
I want to ask you, do they treat you to leave the country? When you go arrested, for instance?
So, many times people that I would discuss these issues with, they would respond either with the response, why do you live here, or then get out of here, or go to Gaza, or any of that sort of responses. But yes, also the authorities, they, for example, when I get arrested, then those people in the police and the army, they are pretty much inseparable. You also have policemen who are actually doing their military service, soldiers who are doing their military service in the police and so on, so it's the same type of mentality. And yes, being arrested, there is the treatment, or not the physical treatment, but the mentally, the way that we are being treated, it is very harsh, and including phrases like, I wish you would die, and so on. But
I want to say,
yes.
the threat to go to leave the country. You never have been subjected
No, not with threat. No. That would be an interesting turn of events. No, because it would mean quite a lot if Israel would kick out its privilege. Yes. Now, actually, the thing about the BDS law, the anti-BDS law that I mentioned before, Israel uses political repression all the time against Palestinians. What is new about that law? Not that it goes against freedom of expression and all of that, but that it is using this type of repression against its own, against the privileged. That's what's new about it. And that is why, personally, I don't mind if they take me to court, because if they would take someone like myself, one of the privileged, to court for speaking up my mind against Israeli criminality, then that would be the biggest boost for the BDS campaign. So let them. So far they haven't tried it, because they're afraid of the consequences, I think.
Okay.
I wonder what happens to the Jaffa oranges. When I was, a little bit younger, there were Jaffa oranges everywhere, and now they disappeared. Have they renamed it, or what's happened to them?
I mean, now the oranges that are sold from Israel, it's rather Agrexco, the company who is doing the export import. Jaffa, I think it still exists, the label, but it's for the...
Not in our supermarkets, because I really looked for them and you can't find Jaffa oranges.
Yeah. But by the way, and this is another stuff, there is this very nice film from Eyal Sivan about the inhaled. No, but it's no matter Agrexco, and nowadays Mehadrin, the companies who merchandise the oranges.
Yeah, but perhaps, is it because Jaffa oranges wouldn't sell anymore? Or?
No, it's
not for that.
Okay.
No.
First of all, the story of the Jaffa oranges is very interesting, and there is the wonderful film called Jaffa, the Oranges Clockwork. And through the story of the oranges, he tells the whole story of Zionism, how they came over, took over, and even made the Jaffa oranges, which were a Palestinian symbol, into a Zionist symbol. Just like with the sabas, with cactus fruit, same thing. Now, Jaffa, which is where I live, by the way, Jaffa, it was full of orange orchards. There were poems written about it. And in 1948, only 5% of the people of Jaffa remained. The rest became refugees, many of them in Gaza. And yes, the label, Jaffa oranges, became a Zionist symbol and the Zionist label. Today, actually, they have sold the rights for the label, and I don't remember who exactly owns it. I think it's a Spanish company, but I'm not sure about it. Anyway, even if you have a Jaffa orange, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is actually coming from Jaffa. It may be, it may not be. One more comment that I would like to say about fruits and vegetables coming from Israel. Agrexco, which is the largest exporter and which suffered, actually it went bankrupt, now it is under Mehadrin.
And Agrexco coming on stage again.
Yes, and Agrexco coming back on stage. They, on purpose, do not distinguish between settlement products, those avocados, dates, whatever grown in the occupied territories, with the West Bank mainly, and those grown in what we refer to as Israel proper. So they mix it together, or they mislabel and so on, so that makes all of their produce illegal, basically. And that's one thing, I mean, just according to these laws and EU regulations. The other thing is that when they grow, for example, in the Jordan Valley, we have to remember that the water, like I mentioned, the natural resources and all are given to one select group, or mainly, there is discrimination there. So when they grow these dates or avocados or whatever, they literally dry up Palestinian wells, and they literally take this water away from the Palestinian neighbors who live in horrible conditions, and sometimes in the dry season in the Jordan Valley, which is a very dry place, these people have to send their families away for a couple of months because there is simply not enough water to sustain themselves. So every avocado and every date that comes from these companies, and it doesn't matter if it comes from Israel or not, because they don't make the distinction, carries with it also a very moral price.
I would like to add something on this question of boycott of fruit and vegetable. I think it has several advantages. One advantage is that it's very sensitive to some extent. You see the fruit, you can feel it, you like it, and so on. So it's in proportion of the financial impact. It's not high. It's maybe 5% maximum of the Israeli export is agricultural export. So it doesn't really make the difference, but it's a good way to address people and to communicate or to communicate something. Second point, I think so far much of the work has been done on the question of the occupied territories and produce that comes from there and the mislabeling and all these questions. I really would like to work much more also on the question of agriculture inside Israel and exactly on the question of discrimination in land and the question of discrimination in water distribution. And I think there we would really have like very nice case studies on different produce, like in Switzerland. We got an information about the exact place where the new potatoes come from and where the peanuts come from. It's some kibbutzim which are close to the Gaza border. And here I think it would really be nice to work on that much more, on the question how much water they get, and part of it which is extracted even from the upper river from the Jordan through whole Israel and so on. And then you have this kind of desalination companies at Ashkelon, and you have an amount of water which is even more than the farmers in the Negev need. But 5 kilometers beside that you have the Gaza Strip with this whole catastrophe on the water question and so on. So I think it would be nice to work on this, or for instance some of the localities, not all, but some are in destroyed villages. You could link one food to the history of the village where it is now produced, or to the kibbutz where it is produced, and the village which used to be there before, and so on. So I think there's really, there would be good opportunities to work on special produce. And maybe just to mention this paper which was produced by the Palestinians, by agricultural associations and NGOs who are close to the BDS campaign. In English it's called Cultures of Injustice, and it describes the negative impact of the Israeli agricultural industry on the Palestinian economy. So this was translated to German and to French. Here they have a lot of copies, or enough copies for everyone. And for instance, in Switzerland now we made a mailing, we sent it out to 1,500 companies that do have some links to fair trade, ecological agriculture and so on. So it's just part of making this kind of awareness raising. But I think it's a nice, it's an important field, and also, by the way, for the Palestinians, agriculture is still a bigger, or has a bigger impact than it has for the Israelis. So there's a lot of destruction and a lot of suffering on the Palestinian side, and there's a lot of complicity of the Israeli agricultural industry. So definitely I think it's a good field to work on.
Okay, perhaps the last two questions, because we have to, okay, two questions we have, please. Yes?
How are the laws in Austria and especially dealing with the boycott? How is the legality to go around it if there are laws to prevent it? Because I know, especially in Austria, and maybe Germany, but I know that in Austria, here in Vienna, well, it's like, no, you cannot touch Israel. Not just the occupation, any boycott, is there any legality against the call for boycott of Israel?
You mean by the law?
By the law, yes.
No.
It's not like in France. In France, the people which went into the supermarket,
Yes.
they have problems with the law.
But it's different levels. If you
Just
go.
to clear, what I'm saying, I was with a woman in black one day in Vienna, and suddenly, like 10 police came.
Yeah.
And they were like reading the leaflet, which said nothing. And someone called, the police said they're just giving anti-Semitism crap. That's what it is. And then the police came and they kept reading it so back and forth. I was telling them, what are you really looking for? I mean, can they associate boycott with anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah? Will you face this?
So you already gave part of the answer. I mean, if there is the case of anti-Semitism, okay, there is a legal basis on it. So you, I mean, the BDS campaign does not talk about Judaism and ethnicity and so on. So normally there is no case of anti-Semitism in the publications. But if there would be, or if there would be a legal basis for making claims against a leaflet or something else. Second is, if you step into a shop, normally it's private property, so you have to respect the rules of, they might even say that you are not allowed to be, I don't know how many meters of the trottoir, where you are not allowed to stay is okay. So then it's a question of force, either you are enough to stay there or you have to withdraw. The third point is the legal basis of boycott. There recently some Dutch lawyer. Lawyer? No, he's not a lawyer, but he's a jurist. I don't know. Lawyer? Okay, he made a study on the question whether the rules of the WTO, it forbids boycott or not. And his result is that, at the contrary, they would be obliged, at least for settlement products, they would be legally obliged to forbid settlement produce. So this is, now we enter the question of international law and so on, and how you can implement it or enforce it, and it's a question of power relations, but definitely you should try to defend your case, and I don't think there is any legal basis in general to forbid boycott, at least not in Austria, as far as I know, not in Switzerland. And in France, okay, there can be maybe an organization which makes a process because you destroy the fruit or products, or you did not withdraw from their space. But as far as I know, no, there's no legal basis for making a process because you advocate the boycott. And those who boycott Nestle, those who boycott the wooden, certain kind of wood that is produced under conditions of human rights violations and so on. It's a very common tool. It's used in many respects.
So, legally speaking, in France, for example, yes, there were many attempts to take people to court. They have by now failed miserably, but definitely there are such attempts. So French activists are more prone to such a risk of being sued and taken to court for all kinds of preposterous claims, including that they participate in crime, in hate crime or anti-Semitism and so on. But very recently, 2 cases have been closed, and the ones who were sued have been acquitted. And in total, I think that there are more than 4 cases that have been acquitted, and there was no new lawsuit in the past couple of years. And that tells us something. That is in France. So that is very encouraging. Now, about the whole case of anti-Semitism. Here I come as the privileged Israeli Jew to say two things. That it seems like this is my role, and this is my, I'm in the position, most in the position to say this. First of all, BDS is not against Israelis. It is against the criminal Israeli institutions. Secondly, BDS is also not anti-Semitic. On the contrary, it stands in opposition to all forms of racism, including that of Zionism. And what we are promoting is equality, equal rights, freedom, justice, respect for international law. All of these cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic in any way. However, the definition of anti-Semitism in different places in Europe is very problematic, because in some places the definition is flawed, very flawed, and it says that some sort of criticism of the criminal state of Israel may be interpreted as anti-Semitic. And I absolutely negate that. So I absolutely think that this has to be changed. And this is probably due to political pressure coming from Israel and so on, but this has to be challenged. The most anti-Semitic body, or the most anti-Semitic voice that exists today, it actually comes from the state of Israel, where Israel tries to claim that any person who criticizes its criminal policies is also speaking against all the Jews worldwide. In other words, what they are saying is that all the world Jewry, all the Jews worldwide, think in the same way and protect, support the criminal state of Israel. And if you're critical of this criminal state of Israel, you're also critical or hateful and so on of Jews. That is absolutely unacceptable. That is an absolutely racist statement, an anti-Semitic statement coming from the state of Israel. Luckily, there are some ethnic Jews also inside Israel who are opposed to their government's criminal policies. And there are many, actually, Jews around the world, ethnic Jews around the world, who are taking part in the BDS campaign. There is a very large percentage of Jewish activists in the BDS campaign. So, in one line, there is absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism with BDS. Actually, quite the opposite. We are very much against all forms of racism. And yes, the definition of anti-Semitism in Europe has to be changed and has to be challenged.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
I just wanted to say that we shouldn't underestimate the pro-Israeli groups inside of Austria, because they are very, very big. And for example, they always, people always, I mean, when the massacres were in Gaza, there was, for example, one man who was taken to court by this group, Johannes Wiener, who was then not charged, but he was taken to court. But people who sat in the front row, the two blonde people, they are from the group Free Gaza from Hamas, and I think they are very well organized in Austria. And if BDS will get more attention, you will be soon on the radar. So I don't think you should underestimate it, even if it's not by law that they. I think.
What's the name of this?
For me,
I don't know his last name. I saw Johannes Wiener.
Johannes Wiener, do you know Johannes Wiener?
No, he was charged. He was from the AKP.
Yeah.
Okay. He was charged. It's just an example, what I know. But I think it's nothing to be underestimated.
but not to be overestimated also. That's what I wanted to say, because I think also the pro-Zionist organizations and people and so on, they also choose their targets, and they choose people which they can intimidate. And if you are well informed, if you have a campaign which has really good foundations and good argumentation and so on, you are much less victim of this kind of intimidation than those who are not sure about what they are talking about and maybe could be intimidated with this kind of accusation of being anti-Semitism, or maybe they even do not really have a clear idea about the differentiation of anti-Semitism and pro and criticism on Israel and so on. So really I have observed in many cases that those who are attacked and put under pressure, it's rather people who try to be mainstream and don't really know how to defend their arguments and so on. So I think also in Austria you have a space, and what is even interesting for me, or more interesting, 5 years ago everyone said in Germany you could never talk about boycott. But that's past. There's a lot of groups now in Germany that have adopted to defend the BDS campaign, and they do boycott at least on settlement products, although it's somehow limited, and I think it would be better to talk about complicit companies than to make a geographical or local distinction. But nevertheless, they really have done steps ahead, also in Germany, and so I think in Austria it is possible.
I don't know to whom you are advising that we should not underestimate the Israeli lobby in Austria, but of course we, and me, I'm from the from the Union from Anti-Racism and Peace Policy, so we are working since more than 10 years on the topic of Palestine, and we were accused on everything. To be a Taliban, to be, I don't know, Al-Qaeda, to be everything. So, yeah, well, yes, we know which sort of defamation is coming, which sort of attacks also, of course, but yes, we have to take this, do it, I think. Ronnie, you have to. Okay, is there any further? Well, any other short, you wanted to say, okay.
I hope it's short, I don't know. I have a lot of Israeli friends, a lot of Jewish friends, and all of them say, of course we want peace. But no one really knows how it should look like, or actually no one wants to do something about it. Because, of course, for them the situation is nice. So I wondered what happened, or if something happened to you, so you became engaged in the BDS movement.
Just one word, by the way, Ilan Pape is writing a whole book about this, called Out of the Frame, how to come outside this Zionist thinking in Israel. But Ronnie, you can also tell us.
So my story, in a nutshell, I didn't grow up in a very Zionistic family, but like every person growing up in Israel, I was brainwashed to a certain extent, or I underwent this machine of indoctrination. And yes, we are being taught that Israel wants peace and offers its hands for peace, and so on. What happened to me personally is that for many years, for 6 years, I was contemplating the idea of whether I wanted to serve in the army or not. Military service is mandatory in Israel.
How come you contemplated it for 6 years? I mean, did you have a gap in between, or were you contemplating it since you were 12?
No. Good question. I first went to university, so I had 3 years of high school, 3 years of university to think about it. Okay. Good question. And then during that time, I realized all sorts of things about Israeli politics and so on, and I was supportive of, for example, the nuclear whistleblower, but still, even though all that, and that is regarded as radical enough, I felt that if I would not serve in the army, I would be some sort of a parasite or a traitor. Because the indoctrination is very strong, the social pressure is very strong. So I did get drafted. But almost less than 2 months into the army, I also realized, one thing that I realized was that it was time to stop eating animals, because I was also thinking about becoming vegetarian and so on. Now I'm vegan. But the other thing that happened, pretty much at the same time, was that I realized that I have a choice here, and that from that moment on, I was no longer a soldier. From that moment on, I had no obligation to the state or to the nationality, but rather my obligation was to humanity, to something that is universal. And once I realized that, then everything else was quite easy. The whole notion of being a parasite or a traitor just disintegrated in front of my eyes. It had no meaning anymore. And from that moment on, it was clear, because the situation is very clear about who is in the right and who is in the wrong. And obviously, I chose to stand by the oppressed rather than by the oppressors. But what happens with those who didn't come out of this Zionist type of thinking is that they insist on being Zionist and moral. I'm talking about the liberal Zionists that I mentioned before. The right wing, they don't want to be Zionist and moral, they just want to be Zionist. They don't care about the language of peace and human rights. But those who speak that language of peace and human rights, they insist on holding the stick in both hands, on being Zionist and moral. But that is impossible. There's no such thing as being supremacist and moral at the same time. And basically, their morality only goes to a certain degree. It's only applicable to a certain degree. So when you had the struggle in Tel Aviv for social justice, for example, what they call the struggle for social justice, they didn't say one word about equality. They didn't say one word about the settlements. They didn't say one word about the inflated military budget. Because anything of that sort would immediately be too contentious. So they just talked about social justice, about rights. But whose rights? The rights of the privileged. They didn't talk about the rights of everybody. And that is the main difference. So when Zionists come and say we want peace, including groups like Peace Now, for example, they want peace under their terms, but they are not in a position to come up with the terms. At the very least, we have to ask everybody. And as I said, Israel has very little rights here. It has mostly obligations. So, and one main right that has to be respected is the right of the refugees, which Israel and pretty much all Israelis out there are very much against. But they will have to get over it, because if they want to live in a sane state, in a state that respects the rights of everybody, then they will have to respect the rights of everybody, including the refugees. And if they want to carry on living in a supremacist apartheid state, then that is not legitimate, and we will carry on struggling against that.
Yeah, in one sentence, I mean, we have in German, we say, lass mich in Frieden. Maybe in English also we say, let me in peace. I don't know. It doesn't. It also can just mean, I don't want to hear anymore about this conflict. So it would be nice to have it settled somehow. But this does not say anything about the conditions. So probably they would have to be challenged on that. I mean, you wish to live in peace. Of course, almost everyone wants to live in peace. It doesn't say anything about the conditions you're living in.
Okay, before coming to the end, just two things. In the next room you will find an information table with all materials on the subject. And please don't forget to enter your details in the list for information on the information table to get our newsletter, the newsletter of BDS. We have snacks, so coffee, tea, some salad and bread, so we can continue discussing the issue, of course. Lastly, I want to draw your attention to the recent book of the host, Barkan, Remapping Palestine. It's a book about the NGOization in the West Bank, but also on BDS and other issues. It's on the information table. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock we have the workshop here, also for the activists who want to be active in BDS are warmly welcome to discuss the possibilities in Austria and Vienna to make BDS. Ronnie and Birgit, thank you very, very much for this very, very interesting contributions. Thank you for coming and attending the discussion, and you hopefully to stay in contact and to be active in BDS. Thank you so much.